Is Chad Cruiser. Actually, I'll use this mic here. My name is Chad Cruiser, and my wife and I have a documentary film company called Anchor Point Films, where we go around to archaeologists, historians, scholars, medical professionals, and we make documentaries on various different subjects from history, archaeology, health, longevity, these kind of things. But tonight, we're specifically talking about overcoming the media trap naturally. You may have heard this saying before, never forget that thoughts work out actions, repeated actions form habits, and habits form character. That this is a summation of psychology, just kind of summed up in a sentence, that never forget that thoughts work out actions, repeated actions form habits, and habits form character. Many times people try to change their character, but they go back to the same old habits. They try to stop their bad habits, but they fall back into the same unhealthy actions because what has not been changed, specifically the mind. And so some of you probably heard before, if you've ever taken a Psych 101 course, Psychology 101, you probably heard the story about a man by the name of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker in the state of Vermont, and he was working, this is back mid-1800s, 1848 specifically, and as Phineas was working as the foreman of a railroad crew, so you have to have enough intellect to lead a group of men, and what they were doing is they would drill down into the rocks in the mountainsides of Vermont, and they would they would drill down into the rock, and they would then fill it with something like gunpowder, and they put on top of it some sand, and they tamp it down with about a 3-foot long rod called a tamping iron. And one day as Phineas was tamping down, some way, somehow it ignited, it exploded, and it shot up and it hit Phineas under his cheek, and it literally blew through his head, taking out one of his eyes with it, and as it went, it just continued on and it sailed right through, like a missile right through him. And you'd think being mid-1800s, it must have killed him. Strangely enough, within minutes, Phineas was able to stand, he was able to walk, and anybody that was around, he would walk up to them, he'd tell them, I just had a rod blow through my skull. And they're looking at him and they could see the damage, and his cognition largely was still there. He could still talk to you, but what changed about Phineas was not just his intellect per se, but his character. He went from a moral, upstanding, religious Christian man to an immoral man. He forsook his wife and family and he joined a traveling circus. And so, just to give you an idea, the frontal lobe, this area, we just had it drawn gray for the illustration's sake at the top, but the gray area there would be called the frontal lobe, and he lost this part. This is the area that the rod went through, but it didn't stick. It went right through, as we said. And research shows that the frontal lobe is the seat of spirituality, morality, and the will. It is the decision-making center. Some have referred to it as the citadel of the mind, the citadel of the mind. And so this gray portion of the brain, obviously it's not colored like this, the pink and gray, but the gray portion here for our illustration's sake is the frontal lobe. And so it is the decision-making center of the brain. When you're trying to decide between kind of good and bad, much of that decision is being processed in the frontal lobe. So if we have lifestyle habits that are negatively impacting our frontal lobe, it's going to hurt our decision-making. Now, we're talking about media tonight, and we're going to see its effect on the frontal lobe. But media consumption. According to Nielsen, the average American over the age of 18 spends over 11 hours a day interacting with media. Sounds almost hard to believe, doesn't it? You think like, come on, 11 hours? But if you think about it like this, what do many people maybe wake up in the morning to the radio. So now you're interacting with media. Then you go from that particular media, many people then, they jump on their cell phone and they check the news, or they check Facebook, or they check Instagram, and so they go from that, and then they're maybe watching some news as they're preparing, having breakfast, and then they jump in the car and they sit in utter silence in the car, right? Very few people, right? You turn on the radio. So now you also have media interacting. Then often people work and they work on computers, so they're also on a computer. Or young people are in school, often on a screen in school. So you can see how much this could add up over the course of a day. And according to Pew Research Center, 45% of teens say that they are online almost constantly. They are online almost constantly. Now, here's the thing. We live in one of the richest countries on planet Earth. My wife and I have the opportunity to travel the world, but looking at the happiness in America, one of the richest countries in the world, according to a Harris poll, 33% of Americans say that they are happy. Does that sound like a good number? A third of Americans are happy. That means roughly 2/3 are not quite happy. That's a significant number. I don't say that as an insult or to be pejorative. This is just what the research shows. And really, actually, these are it is kind of sad to think about. And what they did find, though, before we go on to this, what they did specifically find was that back in 2008, people were a little bit happier. Do you remember what was taking place in 2008? Yeah, you had the economic recession or the Great Recession, right? And yet people were what then? A little bit happier, not massively, but it's interesting that it doesn't seem that money seems to be the main driving factor of happiness. Because if the main thing that made people happy was money, you think Americans would be much happier, but that's not what we see. Now, we're going to move on to the growing brain and media, the growing brain in media. Now, until 2016, the American Academy of Pediatrics suggested that children up to the age of 2 should have zero amount of screen time. Zero amount of screen time. So basically, infants up to the age of 2, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, up until 2016, they said no time for babies, no time for infants looking at screens. But the reality is that what we see by and large? Not necessarily much of the time anyway. Much of the time today, children, their babysitter is a cell phone or an iPad or a television, right? You don't have to interact with them. The screen can teach them everything they need to know. And are there any side effects of allowing this to happen, of allowing children to just grow up on screens? Well, let's look at this. It's become the babysitter of the children. Well, let's see what we see here. So this is, it's cut off a little there, but it's effective TV on brains of children. What do we see? A study was conducted looking at the amount of television children watch up till the age of 3. And they followed the children to the age of 7 and discovered that for every additional daily hour of TV children watch, it increasingly impaired their memory and reading skills. And it is so true. Now, I say this as someone who grew up with tremendous amount of screen time as a child, meaning I was looking at tremendous amounts of television as a child, and also struggled with reading, and not until later in life became a real reader. Now I thoroughly enjoy reading, but I didn't as a child. And you're going to see that there's a good reason for this. So it not only impacts their reading skills, but it also negatively impacts the memory of children to have them watching a bunch of television. Well, let's look at the aggressive behavior and television. Children aged 3 from 20 cities were studied looking at their direct and indirect television viewing and the resulting effect on aggression. And, we'll get back there a moment. And television viewing was significantly associated with aggression in 3-year-olds, and more television seemed to cause more aggression. So it's interesting, it was also, they could tell by countries when they look back on the world, because, television, obviously you didn't have something like that back in the 20s, 30s, and when America started to get it, it was a number of years later they could tell that crime increased. Now, people didn't immediately know that there was an association, but then the other countries of the world did not receive television as early as we did. So then they could look at other nations, and they would realize that after nations gained televisions, that crime rates would go up a number of years after. So they could actually forecast the crime waves that would begin a number of years after the introduction of television in various countries. It was quite predictive. And looking at, this is, you can't see the title, but it says Internet Addiction and Brain Shrinkage. Sorry, I'll try to fix the slides tomorrow so we can see them a little bit better. And scientists wanted to find the effect of internet addiction on the brain. And what did they find? They looked at 18 internet-addicted 15-year-olds and 15 non-addicted 15-year-olds and gave them MRI scans of their brains. So they scanned the brains of these young people, some of which were addicted to the internet and others were not. And what did they find? They discovered that those who were internet addicted had shrinkage of their gray matter in their brains. The gray matter is the outermost portion of the brain where we have our higher thinking processes. So the higher reasoning centers in young people who are addicted to the internet has physically shrunk as a result of overconsumption of things like the internet. Now, I want to be very clear. I do not think that the internet or television itself is in and of itself a bad thing. These things can be used in a very positive and beneficial way. But we see that when they are overused, it has a negative side effect, literally to the physical structure of the human brain. This is very serious to think about. So let's look further. One of the portions that shrunk is known as the left anterior cingulate cortex. And this is a part of the brain, this is one of the other areas of the brain that may have to do with love. And not just any kind of love, not like a, what would we say, maybe just seeing somebody and thinking they're quite beautiful and feeling, I'm really attracted to that individual. But this kind of love is a more mature love, like a love that has been deepened. And that portion of the brain is potentially literally shrinking. Now think about that. So if this is shrinking the brains of people, but not just any portions, an area that has to do with love, do you think that could affect society? People having less love, not only being less loving, but actually having less physical capacity within their brain for human love. It's interesting, the Bible actually prophesied in the last days that the love of many would grow cold. In Matthew 24, verse 12, the love of many would grow cold. It's also interesting that the Bible says in 1 John chapter 4, it says that verse 18, it tells us that God is love. He that knows not love knows not God, for God is love. Now, if God is love and we're shrinking the portion of the brain that has to do with love, could it be shrinking our spiritual capacity to even care about things like God? What a thought. What a thought. Could this be one of the factors that is causing society more and more to have less interest in spiritual things? What a heavy thought. What do we see? Let's go forward here. Now, shrinkage of the frontal lobe. A major portion of the brain that is damaged by a large amount of screen time is the frontal lobe. Researchers have discovered that those who are addicted to internet or gaming have decreased the volume of their frontal lobes. And once again, frontal lobe is the seat of spirituality, morality, and the will. It is the decision-making center, right? So this decision-making center, could it be that as we're actually physiologically shrinking this portion of the brain, we're making it so that young people are less apt to make good and healthy decisions, Now, let's go forward. Screen time and interpersonal relationships. Portions of the brain negatively affected by large amounts of screen time are those that have to do with healthy relationships and empathy. There's a portion of the brain called the insula. And one of the portions of the brain negatively affected by large amounts of screen time is the insula, and that's a portion of the brain that has to do with empathy. And empathy is not just sympathy, it's almost feeling the feelings of others. You know, sensing and being able to maybe read it in the faces of others or experience what other people are experiencing. And imagine, could this be negatively impacting social interaction once again? Absolutely. So that if we're shrinking portions of the brain that hurt the ability to be able to see each other, talk to each other, communicate with each other, could this be hurting interpersonal relationships with young people? Now, I'm going to share with you something very interesting. My wife and I, we travel full-time, literally. We officially live in Michigan. We had a house built there last year, and we got moved in the fall. We haven't spent 2 consecutive weeks there because we travel all the time. But obviously, Florida's a much nicer place to be this time of year than Michigan anyway. But we were just up last week, we were up in Wisconsin, we were speaking at an academy, a high school that happened to be a boarding school that invited us out to come and speak to their high school students. And we speak at all kinds of different schools, and so some of the schools we speak at are just, all the kids have their cell phones, and so just like a normal school. But this particular school, they actually had a rule, no cell phones. And it was amazing. It was amazing. These young people, my wife with me, she said, man, you guys are living like the 1990s. And we were hanging out with these young kids. We were eating with them. They had a cafeteria. They stayed at the school, and we would eat with them every morning. Actually, 3 times a day, we would eat with them. And one of the fascinating things is these young people would literally come and sit down with us and talk with us. It sounds like a miracle, doesn't it? Right? It was amazing. They would literally, and I say that, that would have been normal human experience in the history of the earth. That what do people do when they eat? They talk, they interact, they communicate with each other. That's like one of the most normal things of all Earth's history is that humans communicate each other when they break bread together. Yes or no? That's like as normal as can be. But it's not that way anymore, at least not the way that it used to be. And so as we were at the school, I even told them, as we were speaking to these young people, I said, this is totally different. Being with you young people that are not allowed to have cell phones while you're at school, you are totally different than what we normally run into in schools. And I thought, what a nice thing for the school to have done for them. And I asked some of the students, I said, what do you think about it? And one of the young ladies said, yeah, you just get used to it. It's fine. But I think they're actually, I think they're much happier because of it, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But in order to have empathy helps us to connect with people, to be friendly. There's a verse back in the Hebrew Scriptures in Proverbs chapter 18, verse 24, that says, a man that has friends must show, and that's the way it was spelled in an old English version, must show himself friendly. I should have just fixed that, but that is the way it was spelled there. A man that has friends must show himself friendly. And that has to do with empathy, right? That you would show friendliness like you would hope that somebody would show it to you, and that helps us to connect on another level, right? And so, we also read in the Scriptures, it says, rejoice with those who do rejoice and weep with those who weep, right? That connecting through empathy, right? Sensing that. We go on to gaming addiction and drug dependence. MRI scans were done comparing individuals who were either addicted or not addicted to video games. And the brain activation in the video game addicted individuals was similar to people who have a drug addiction. It's interesting that many times people who have addictive personalities many times think, well, my addiction is different from your addiction. And sure, we're all different. But the research actually shows that addiction has similar wiring in the brain, kind of regardless of what kind of addiction. So that's why people who have addictive personalities, it doesn't matter what it is, they have addictive personalities, right? Because it's the same portion of the brain. And we're going to actually talk tomorrow when we look at the gut-brain connection on something to potentially do that can be literally revolutionary in the life of a person who struggles with addiction. We'll come on that tomorrow. Now, so what do we see? So looking at this, their brains are similar to someone who has drug addiction. And looking at texting. Now, once again, texting is not innately bad. It's a great way to communicate, to quickly get a message across. But the average 18 to 24-year-old sends and receives an average of 3,853 texts every month. Now, here's the thing. One of the difficulties is, and as young people are doing this, they're often interacting with multiple people at the same time. We would call that multitasking, right? But the trouble is this. One of the great predictors of success in life is the ability to focus your mind on one subject for a decent amount of time. If somebody cannot, If someone cannot focus and their mind is constantly going to other things, it can make it difficult for them to be successful in various areas of life. And so if you're texting 3 different people and you're on 3 different conversations at the same time, we may think, oh, that's very skilled, but it can also be training the brain to not focus. Does that make sense? Because your mind is jumping from subject to subject. And so this can actually be potentially detrimental. And looking at teens and social media usage. Now, by the way, teens do not use Facebook nearly as much as old people. Old people like me, right? The old folks like myself, right? People like my generation were big on maybe, and the generations above would use things like Facebook more, but the children and teens don't want to be on Facebook. Why? Yeah, mom, dad, and grandma are on there, right? They want to interact with their friends in some other way that mom and dad aren't in there, right? And so they use something else. Now, what are the most used platforms of social media for teens? Well, Snapchat and Instagram. Those are the two that they're most likely to use. And it turns out that 76% of teens use Instagram and 75% use Snapchat. You may have read in the newspaper or online that studies have been conducted looking at Facebook specifically, and they found that people who spend significant amounts of time, large amounts of time on things like Facebook are more likely to have higher amounts of depression. Now, once again, it's not innately terrible, go and connect with your friends on Facebook, but people who spend significant amounts of time, longer periods of time, are more likely to come down with depression. And this is a reality for Facebook. But that being said, what social media platforms are most likely to increase your chances of being depressed? The number one is Instagram, and number two is Snapchat. So these ones, the ones that the young people are using, are the most likely to increase someone's likelihood for being depressed. Now, once again, if somebody's judicious and just using it to interact from time to time, but if somebody's spending just hours just kind of like scrolling through a screen and saying, oh, John's eating a hamburger. Oh, Stacy got some new shoes. Oh, so-and-so's in Hawaii on vacation. Oh, someone just got a new car. But people don't write on there, I am cleaning my bathroom. And they take a picture of the dirty bathroom, right? But the reality is we all have to clean the bathroom sometime, don't we? We just don't market that to the world. And the reality is, so what do people put on social media in general anyway? Some people are a little funny and they'll put other things, but most people put their best foot forward, right? You don't tell everybody about the mundane, it's time to take out the trash or whatever. I mean, you don't do that. So somebody may be sitting home and it looks like everybody else is out to eat or in Hawaii or in Florida or wherever, right? And they're doing something great and I'm just sitting on Facebook, right? And so you see how that could be depressing. Now, once again, it doesn't mean never use Facebook or Snapchat or Instagram or what have you, but the point being that overconsumption of these forms of social media can be detrimental to our mental health. Now, I titled this Suicidal Cell Phones. What do we see here? A study by Florida State University revealed that mental health problems, depression, and suicide attempts increased along with increased ownership and use of cell phones. But once again, there's some, not all correlation is necessarily causation. But what did they find here? They found kind of a correlation that went a little deeper. It revealed that those who spent 5 or more hours a day on electronic devices had a 48% likelihood of suicidal behavior. These are incredible numbers. Incredible. And remember, we read earlier that young people said they are online almost what? Constantly. That's what the research shows. So many young people may be having suicidal behaviors. We see that many people are not very happy right now. And one of the factors is overuse of media. Because here's the thing about social media. We call it social media, but is it enhancing our sociability with the research we've already looked at? No, so it's making us potentially less social, yet we feel like we're being social because we're putting a thumbs up on people's statements or we're putting a smiley face next to it, but it's not actually real, normal social interaction where you look somebody in the eyes, that you talk with them, that you discuss with them. It also makes it so that people are much more likely to say rude things than they normally would, right? On the internet, people don't mind just really clobbering somebody over the head for their political opinion or just being absolutely furious. Typically, you wouldn't hear some of this harsh rhetoric face to face. Some people will. Some people don't mind really, being real curmudgeons to people. But most people, we have some kind of social interaction where we don't want to be too hard on each other in person, because when there's a person, it's easy to say when somebody's not around, oh boy, I would have said this or that or whatever. And so people really do say that on Facebook or whatever. But when you're face to face with someone, somebody's a human now. Because now they're not just a belief system or a political party. they're a human being, right? They're a human being. And so, once again, we may be actually lacking in our social skills, lacking in social interaction time. And not only that, often when families are together, what is everybody in the house doing at the time? Or even if they're out somewhere, everybody is often sitting on their device, right? And so you see whole families or whole groups of young people together, and they can't put their cell phones away for a moment. Because they feel like they're missing something. There's a term they use for it. It's FOMO. Anybody know what FOMO means? Fear of missing out. And so you're with people where you should be interacting, you should be communicating with them, but you're afraid you're going to miss something on the internet. So you're not really interested in the humans around you in reality, you're interested in the humans that are in cyberspace. And so it's actually truly hampering our... And one of the young ladies we read, and I just had a man, probably about my age, nearly 40, I'm 39 years old, he's 39 years old, and he told me just this past weekend, he said, while I'm with humans, I'm constantly thinking I would rather be on the internet. Someone say amen? But that is what's happening with us, that we care less and less for human interaction because we're so interested in what's the news or what's going on Facebook or what's going on whatever it is. And so, but this may be hurting our social interaction. So let's go forward. Dopamine receptors within our brain. Scientists have discovered that a portion of the brain of internet-addicted men revealed that these men had less dopamine receptors. Now, I can tell just about everybody in the room is old enough to remember when they used to call drugs dope. Remember that? Where do you get your dope? And obviously dope comes from this dopamine, this neurotransmitter that we have in our brains. And it's interesting that research has shown that people who are addicted to certain drugs have lower levels of dopamine receptors in their brains. It's kind of like what happens is when you first do a drug, it feels incredible. And then the second time you do it, you need to do a little bit more, or after a while, you have to do a little more to try to feel like you did the first time. And then after a while, you have to do a bunch, and then after a while, you can never feel as good. You can never really feel as good as you did the first time. And what potentially happens in these people is that the dopamine receptors, you begin to lose them, and so then life isn't as enjoyable because now you have less of these receptors that help you just have normal enjoyment of life. And we see potentially the same thing is happening with people who are addicted to the internet. That could it be, and I just wrote this question here, could it be that filling our children's lives with media consumption, overconsumption of media, is lowering their enjoyment of every other part of life? And what I mean is this, if you ask, or if you don't ask, if you are with young people, one of the most, and this is not an insult, it's just an observation, what is the most common statements of young people, if they're not playing a video game or they're not on a phone, one of the most common statements is, I'm bored. Could it be that they literally have less dopamine receptors, making it so life is not as enjoyable as it could be? It's not physiologically possible to have the same level of enjoyment with life that you had as a child. It isn't possible presently. But I do believe there is hope that as we lower the usage of some of these things, that our brains actually are very malleable, very changeable. They have what researchers call plasticity. They can change. That's the good news. So even though these things seem hopeless, they are not hopeless, and we'll get back to that. Now, looking at screen time and print on the memory, meaning if you were to take something that is like a book, and you were to read it on a screen versus reading it in a book, is there any difference? Does it have any effect on the brain? Students on average enjoy reading better on a screen than in a book. They also claim that they have better comprehension while reading on a screen. Well, so researchers actually put it to the test to find out, is it true that young people actually retain more, they comprehend better while they are on a screen? Well, research showed that when put to the test, it turns out that if they had to read more than a page, they retain more when they read from a printed book. So if you're going to read something long, if you want to have the best chance of retaining it, you would, if it's more than a page, it is better to read it from a hard copy. And I don't mean a hard book, but you understand what I'm talking about. Like an actual printed book is better for, and you can probably remember from your school days that one of the things that would happen, you might have been in high school and you were taking your biology class and you were taking a test and they asked you a particular question, and in your head you might have remembered, oh yeah, I remember the answer was on the right page up toward the top. You ever remember having something like that happen? Because part of our memory has to do with spatial ability. That's one of the things in the hippocampus, a part of the brain that has to do with spatial ability. And that's also a part of the brain that has to do with memory in general. So as you're looking at it, you might remember there's like a tactile and a sense and a visual area that you see. Whereas if you're just scrolling through something and scrolling, there's not really a spatial connection to your brain. Does that make sense? So it doesn't have that same connection, but yet if you have a book that you're reading, your brain may think, oh yeah, you saw that on that particular page. But we're losing that with the potential using it on digital media. So I would challenge everybody to read more. Spend more time reading in actual books. It's not as if it's like a sin to read. I do sometimes read things on my phone, even books on my phone, but in general, I really do enjoy reading much better in an actual printed book, and we know that we will statistically retain more as a result of it. So let's look at different forms of media, different forms of television rather, on the brain. A study was done looking at the effect of a fast-paced cartoon, an educational program, or drawing on children's executive function. Executive function may actually take place specifically in the frontal lobe. And what do we see? We see that it turned out that children watching a 9-minute fast-paced cartoon did substantially worse when it came to executive function than the other children in the group. So watching these fast-paced, as Frank was talking about, where the scenes are constantly changing, and you see especially children's cartoons today, they almost look like insanity. Like there's no point to it. It's just like things bouncing around on a screen and just absolute and utter insanity with no real point. And I mean, it's amazing, but just all that excitement and flashing scenes and colors changing, it's exciting to the brain, but the brain has a way of kind of shutting down. It not completely, we're not saying it literally shuts down completely, but it goes into this alpha state of brain waves, close to a hypnotic state. And so once again, as Frank also mentioned, that what happens is we become very receptive to the messages that this particular medium is offering to us while we're observing it. Dr. Daniel G. Amen, who has probably done more brain scans than almost anybody on Earth. This man has done on various different subjects, and as people are doing various different things, but he pointed out in a book called Magnificent Mind at Any Age, he said another study published in the Journal of Pediatrics reported that for every hour a day children watch television, there is a 10% increased chance of them being diagnosed with ADHD. This means that if the child watches 5 hours a day, she has a 50% chance of being diagnosed with ADHD. That's heavy, isn't it? So could it be, many times we just think, oh, this is just my grandchild, that's just the way they are, this is just my child, that's the way they are. But often many of these children are spending massive quantities of time on the screens, whether it be video games or whether it be television, what have you. And these things are making it more likely that the children don't have the capacity to focus. Once again, this constant changing of scenes and reference and no point to it. And I mean, most of what they're watching is probably not educational programming. So as a result, we're seeing such high levels of ADHD also. Now, we also talked about the growing brain media. We're going to skip this right now. But I find this very interesting here. Most of you have heard of a lady by the name of Madonna. Have you heard of Madonna? Yes, right? And Madonna is not known for being kind of like a conservative, moral person, right? That's not what she's been known for over the years, right? She would be more, I don't know, something other than that, obviously. It's interesting, though, when this lady, who I grew up, she'd be on MTV when I was a child and so forth. It's interesting that this woman, when she has children, what does she do with them? This is media icon and pop star Madonna. said she does not allow her children to watch television because she says TV is trash. Now, who's putting out the trash on there? Now, historically, it was her. I mean, she's not as young as she used to be, obviously, but the point is, back in the day, she was the one putting so much of the trash on things like MTV, but when she has her own children, does she want their minds to be filled with the garbage that's on there? No. We were visiting someone in their home, and there was a magazine there, and on this particular magazine, there was a cover story with Madonna, and it said, Madonna does not allow her teenage children to have cell phones. Wow. Why? Why would she keep her teenage children? Why would she shelter them like that? It's a good question. Now keep that in mind as we go to the next point. Most of you probably heard of a businessman by the name of Steve Jobs. Have you heard of Steve Jobs? The most successful businessman for sure within my lifetime, one of the most successful businessmen in the history of planet Earth, right? The guy who made the Apple computer, right? Macintosh, the iPhone, the iPad, the Apple Watch, all of these things. This guy came up with these things. Obviously, there's many team working with him, but he's the original instigator behind Apple. And Steve Jobs, it's interesting, he was asked, and I'll just read it here, we can see what it says. In a Sunday article, New York Times reporter Nick Bilton said he once assumingly asked Steve Jobs, so your kids must love the iPad. Jobs responded, they haven't used it. We limit how much technology our kids use at home. What? Why would the guy who made the iPhone, the iPad, and the Mac computer, why would he not let his children use the iPad that he created? I mean, this guy's a multi-millionaire. Obviously, every one of his kids could have all the highest tech gadgets that they could ever possibly want, and yet this man doesn't allow his children to use the technology that he created. That's kind of heavy, don't you think? Why did Madonna not want the kids to use it? Why did Steve Jobs not want it? And continuing, it says here, especially in Silicon Valley, there is actually a trend of tech executives, people in the tech industry, and engineers who shield their kids from technology. So Silicon Valley, you know, the area there of the Bay Area of California, my wife and I have spent time speaking there also. And so you're talking about San Francisco Bay Area, San Jose, and that region. And the guys, these super successful guys in the tech industry, they don't want their kids to use the tech that they're making and designing for the rest of us. But what do we go on to see? So there's actually a trend of tech executives and engineers who shield their kids, you could say shelter their kids from technology. They even send their kids to non-technical schools like the Waldorf School in Los Altos, where computers aren't found anywhere because they only focus on hands-on learning. So do you think the reason these multi-millionaire, successful businessmen who make this technology, do you think the reason they send their kids to non-technical schools without computers is because they want their children to actually be failures in life? Do you think their kids are going to be like poor, like won't understand technology? They'll be 18 and they'll be totally ignorant and unsuccessful. No. I'll bet their kids are going to be the most successful people in America someday. Because their brains are going to be able to focus. They're going to be able to focus on the subject at hand. They're going to be able to focus on human interaction. And one of the greatest predictors of success is way greater than IQ. IQ may be important, but you may know that EQ, which is called the emotional quotient or our emotional intelligence, is more important than our IQ. So your intellect is not as important for your success in life as your social skill to interact with other human beings. You could be super smart but have a super anger problem. And are you going to be successful in life? Unlikely unless you're Steve Jobs. Right? He could do it. He might have had an anger problem, but he at least could run a business well. But for most people, if you have serious interaction problems with other people, you're not going to succeed nearly as well as if you had the ability to empathize, connect with other people, socialize, and have empathy. And so these people, some of the top people in society, have a belief that they want to shelter their kids from these things. Now you think, once again, many parents think, man, I want to make sure that my kid has everything they could possibly have, every video game, everything that will make them happy. But is the research showing that having all these things is making them happy? It actually is more likely to make them stupid. Depressed is what I was looking for. More likely to make them depressed, right? So if we're shutting down these various regions of the brain, not completely, but lowering the amount of information that is traveling to these parts of the brain. Now let's look at ADHD in the brain, strengthening the focus. So let's look at some of the health and healing properties. Let's look at green space and ADHD. Can time in green space positively affect the memory? Well, putting it to the test. A control trial was done with young people with ADHD while not on any medication, taking walks in 3 different locations. It was a 20-minute walk in environments ranging from urban, so city areas, to natural environments. And they tried to match the time of day, noise levels, amount of people in the area to limit these factors so they weren't real changing factors in these situations. What did they find? What did they find as the result is that those in the greenest settings had the best attention following the walk. So something about getting out in nature. What's also interesting is that your average young person today, researchers tell us that they spend an average of 8 minutes outside a day. 8 minutes. Is that how it was when you were a kid? I know when I was a kid, and I'm not that old, we spent, we even spent a lot of our winters in Michigan outside, out in the snow, building igloos and sledding and playing outside, just snowball fights or whatever. You spent your summers, we were out on the street. I grew up in the city, but we were out on the street. All the time we were outside, it seemed. You have some memories in the house, but life was outside. But now 8 minutes, that seems to me like little more than the time it would take to walk outside to the car or to the bus, to go to school and walk into the school and then walk back out of the school. Do they not have recess anymore? And if they do, is it not outside? 8 minutes outside? We're told that the average inmate in a maximum security prison spends an average of about 2 hours outside. So I ask the question, who's really the prisoner? Who's really the prisoner today? Our children may have become inmates in their own homes, trapped in front of a screen that has made them a slave. What a heavy thought, right? What a heavy thought. Enslaved to a screen. I was a child when I first used the computer, because when I was a kid, we didn't have a computer, obviously. And my friend was going to take a class on computers, and they said, oh, you should go. And so I went with him, and we were sitting in front of the computer, and I was probably 7 or 8 years old. Knew nothing about computers. And I had this thought, at 8 years old or 7 years old, someday I can imagine people just sitting in front of these and not interacting. We would just stay on these things. I can't believe I had that thought as a little child and it turned out to be true. It has fully turned out to be true. Not with everybody, but with many, many people, that the screen time is the most important part of life. So those things, but there's a benefit. Now we're going to jump forward for a minute. Notice this, nature, technology, and memory. What do we see? This is walking in nature with and without a phone. Test subjects were to walk through an arboretum to see how nature and technology could affect memory. One group would walk for 30 minutes through an arboretum on the phone. The second group would hand over their cell phone before the walk, and then they'd go on a walk with no cell phone. And another group would take a memory test before going on the walk, just to make sure, just to see where their mind would be before even taking a walk. And what did they find out? They discovered that while taking a memory test, those who were on the cell phone scored about 30%. The results were about the same for those who took the test before the walk. So whether you're on your cell phone, out on a walk in nature, or whether you don't go out in nature at all, you score about the same on this particular memory test, it would seem. What did they find though? Those who walked for a half an hour in nature without a cell phone scored an average of 80% on this memory test. That's 50 percentage points more. 50 percentage points more by going out in nature without any, electronic device with you. There's something about nature that it actually enhances our memory. As we already saw with the children with ADHD, it helped them to be able to focus. It helped them be able to focus. This is interesting. So here is a scientifically proven way to increase brain volume. We've seen that children who are addicted to screen time, it's actually shrinking portions of their brain, like their frontal lobe, and other regions of the brain we've seen. But this is a study, and this is a very good study to know about. As we get into our older years, statistically, our brain begins to atrophy, meaning it begins to deteriorate as we get older. That's not very good news, but this study is very good news. Is there a way to reverse the shrinkage of the brain that we have because of our aging brains? This was a study done at the University of Illinois in 2006, and it was done on people aged 60 to 79. So this is not done on children. What did they find? People aged 60 to 79, these people were previously sedentary, meaning they were not people who exercised formerly. 60 to 79 years of age, they put them on a cardio exercise program over 6 months. Cardio means to have your heart rate increasing. So they put them on a cardio exercise program over 6 months. The control group did non-aerobic toning and stretching. So they would do the stretching exercises. They did MRI scans of their brains, and they discovered an increased frontal and temporal lobe volume in the experimental group, meaning the ones who were getting their heart rate up regularly, were getting this aerobic exercise, actually physiologically increase the volume, the actual size of their frontal and temporal lobes. So it could be that one of the reasons young people are having atrophy to their frontal and temporal lobes is because they're not being active like people used to be. Obviously, as we get older, we get maybe a little more achy joints, we get more tired, and so we're less likely to run around in the backyard on a swing set like we did when we were children, right? So as we get older, we become more sedentary naturally, whereas children used to run around, but they don't do that anymore. So could that be their brains are actually like elderly people's brains? It's a scary thought, isn't it? But the good news about it is that even 60 to almost 80 years old, they've seen that you can actually reverse that in yourself. That's good news for the rest of us, isn't it? And, you can also encourage your grandkids to get outside or your kids to get outside, right? But they saw no increase in the brain structure in the stretching and toning group. So stretching, many people do that thinking it's helping their brain so much. It doesn't seem to, nothing wrong with becoming more limber, but it doesn't have that same benefit to the brain. So, want to keep your brain strong? Get out and do some aerobic exercise. And the great thing is, even if you have maybe arthritis or some joint problems, you might be able to go to a place, maybe swimming, right? Where you have less impact on the joints. My wife had a cousin who was overweight, and he would go and he would just kind of do this. People saw him, they're like, what are you doing? He'd say, oh, I'm exercising. And he was just kind of made it up, but it worked for him. Just being in a pool, moving around, it just gets you, you do whatever it takes for you. I'm not telling you to go hurt yourself. Don't do that. But you can find something, especially if you need some help from your doctor. They might have some suggestions. And getting out and getting some kind of aerobic exercise may actually physically increase the volume of your frontal lobe, that decision-making center, even into our older years. I find this to be very exciting. So, phone time and delayed gratification. Delayed gratification? Some of you probably seen the marshmallow experiment. Anybody ever seen a video on the marshmallow experiment? Okay, not too many of us. Basically, back in the 1960s, they took 3 to 5-year-old children. And the researchers put them in a room with nothing but a table, a chair, and on the table was one plate with one thing on it, and it was a marshmallow. Kids 3 to 5 years of age, they brought them in, and they looked at them and they said, here, if you wait, I'm going to leave the room, and if you can wait till I come back in, if you can wait to eat this marshmallow, when I come back, I will give you another one so you can have 2 marshmallows. And so they videotape these kids. You can go watch it online. It's the cutest thing. The little kids will look at it. The researcher goes out of the room. Imagine there's nothing to do in the room whatsoever except stare at a marshmallow. And so they're staring at the marshmallow, and some of the kids are like this. They're like, like they literally turn away from it so they're, they would tempt them less. Other kids are so tempted, they get down and they sniff it. They're like, and they sniff the marshmallow. So they're kind of tempting themselves a little more. Some of the kids even more. Some of them get to the point where they literally lick the marshmallow. But they didn't eat it. They didn't eat the marshmallow, right? But some of the children had no ability to delay gratification. Some of the kids, before the researcher even finished their sentence, had grabbed it and stuck it in their mouth. No ability to delay gratification. They followed these children for 40 years. And what they found is that kids aged 3 to 5 who had ability to delay gratification for 15 minutes, they would wait until they got a second marshmallow. Those kids went on to do better in their SATs later in life, less likely to struggle with weight problems. They were happier, less likely to use drugs and so forth. In so many levels of their life, they did better having the ability to delay gratification at age 3 to 5. Isn't that amazing? Well, is there anything that can negatively affect our ability to delay gratification? Researchers compared young children who were mobile media users with those who did not use mobile media devices. Children who used mobile media were substantially worse than non-mobile media users when it came to being able to delay gratification. That's heavy, isn't it? So, is there anything we can do? Well, let's find out. This is kind of an interesting, just at least interesting study. Delayed gratification, one of the greatest predictors of success in later life, is a child's ability to have strength in the area of delayed gratification. So, a study was conducted to discover that looking at nature could help increase the power of delayed gratification. Subjects were to look, this is just simply at pictures of nature, mountains or lakes, or pictures of buildings in the city. What did they find? Those who looked at pictures of nature exhibited substantially more power of delayed gratification and self-control. Now, how much better if a kid would actually just get outside, right? How much better to have kids just simply get outside? Now, it's true, there are snakes and there are critters and there are all kinds of things, but weren't they there when you were a kid? I think we become a little too fearful for our children these days, right? Most of us made it till today. At least every one of us here made it till today. And yeah, we got to be careful. I'm not telling you to be crazy, but the reality is sometimes I think we are so protective that kids don't have the opportunity to just learn and play and have a good time. You may have heard of the schools over in the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway. We were just in Norway last summer, I think it was. Been there multiple times, but last summer, these Nordic countries have these. Have you heard of these? Well, you hear of kindergarten, right? Like the garden of children. But in these countries, that's German, but in these countries, you have these kindergartens where they are literally outside 100% of the time. Out in the rain, out in the snow. These kids are just bundled up like little Eskimo children. They're not Eskimos, they're just Norwegian kids or whatever, or Swedish kids. And it's the cutest thing in the world to see them. We were just there, and all of a sudden, these little tiny munchkins just, walking down the road with their teachers. And if you watch them online, these kids, they'll let them play in the trees, and they will be way up in a tree. And they're asking the teacher, they're like, this isn't like a playground. This is just nature. And they're like, aren't you afraid? Look how high that, little tiny child is up in the tree. And the teacher's like, no, not at all. They know what they're doing. And you think, what? We would never allow them to do that. What if they broke their arm or got hurt or whatever? Well, they probably learn real quickly. Oh boy, that wasn't wise. I shouldn't do that again, right? And the reality is these kids, they learn, they have spatial ability. They know how to use their hands. They know how to work with things. They have hands-on learning. And these little children, they're not even really teaching them anything. They're just out in nature. But there's some powerful effects of spending time in nature for our brain. We were meant to be connected with nature. Not to be inside 24 hours a day. Get out in the fresh air, sunshine, or the fresh air that's out there. So, let's go forward. It's interesting what Psalms 72, speaking of looking at the mountains, we just read about the research that would give this mental health benefit. In Psalm 72, verse 3 says, "The mountains shall bring peace to the people, and the little hills by righteousness." We see that there's some mental health benefits to even simply looking at hills. Well, I did see multiple hills on the way over here today, and they were all landfills, right? We don't have, I'm from Michigan too, by the way. Our hills in Michigan are landfills also, so we have that in common. But not a lot of mountains in this part of the country. But the reality is there's still beauty in nature, even if there are no real hills to look at. So let's go forward. Just simply looking at this enhances your ability to delay gratification. Now I want to close with something. As we finish up, this is not a challenge that you have to do at any stretch of the imagination. But there are people who do this and find a great benefit to it. Something to consider maybe for you or even to tell somebody about. One of the things, my wife did this on accident as a young person. When she was young, her and her family, her and her brother began to think, man, we are spending way too much time watching television. It was back in the day before cell phones. And it was back in the day, you remember when humans only used to have one television in the house? Right? And there was only one, and all of a sudden, the TV broke. And some of you remember that there was a time when humans used to fix things. Right? Now if a TV breaks, what do? Yeah, you just you throw it in the landfill and you buy a new one, right? But it used to be you would bring it to a shop and there's a guy who tinkered with it and fixed it and you brought it home. Well, the dad said, "Kids, go fix the TV." And they said, "No, Dad, we don't want to. We want to not watch so much television," but they couldn't keep themselves from doing it. So they finally said, no, we're not going to do it. Well, he didn't get around to bringing it in for close to a month. And so for about a month, they were totally without a television. And they began to socialize more, connect more by accident. And they were, life was it was just really nice. Life was good. The social interaction and so forth. And then Dad brought the TV back into the house after getting it fixed, brought it in, turned it on, they sat down in front of the TV and they're watching it and they're like, "Oh, can you believe they put this on television?" Let me ask you a question. Do you think the TV had changed that much in 30 days? No. What had changed? Their mindset had changed, right? And sometimes we're so filling our lives with things that we just have no sensitivity to what we're watching. We become desensitized, right? And she went on a month-long media fast, and people have been trying, families that aren't connecting like they maybe used to. And I'm not telling you have to do this, but somebody might say, hey, what would happen to my mind? What would happen to my social interactions? What would happen to my spiritual life if I chose to have 1 month off? And I'm not telling you have to do it, but somebody might feel like attempting a 30-day media fast. That doesn't mean if you work with internet, you can't use your internet or these kinds of things. We're not being silly. But I'm not telling you you have to by any stretch of the imagination. But if you feel disconnected to people, if you feel down or depressed, if you feel like maybe your family's not interacting the way you used to, or you're just not interacting, or you just don't enjoy human interaction as much as you used to, I would challenge you to consider, simply even consider, and say, man, maybe should I try a 30-day media fast? Should I choose to, turn off the internet for a month or turn off the television or whatever? See what happens. See if your mind becomes sharper than it was before. See if you begin enjoying human interaction more than you did. See if your life begins to get better. And I'm not telling you then never to go back on, but after the 30 days, then you might be able to more judiciously balance how you use your media. By no means am I pressuring you. By no means am I telling you you have to do this. But just consider it. This might be something that would be a great blessing to you personally. So, the Bible says in Romans chapter 12 and verse 2, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. The first quotation we saw was never forget that thoughts work out actions. Repeated actions form habits, and habits form character. Our character, our habits, and our actions all come from what goes on in our minds. And if we're going to be changed, the ancient text tells us we're going to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. Let's close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you that you care so much for us. I pray that you would draw each one of us nearer to you, that our minds would become healthier, that we would become happier. You intended for us to have true happiness and true joy. And Lord, I pray that we would be renewed in our minds, that our minds would be transformed, that you would draw each one of us nearer to you. In Jesus' name, amen. Now I want to let you know quickly about tomorrow night. Tomorrow night is the gut-brain connection, some exciting research. Literally, and the reason I share this is because it literally changed my life. I went through 10 years of depression off and on, and then what went on in my gut, by changing the way something was going on in my gut, it literally changed my life. Within 2 weeks, my depression went away, and ever since then, I've had the best years of my life. It literally has changed my life. And so that's the reason I share it. And I'm probably the least likely person to tell you about these things, but we're going to look at the research, several different studies on this tomorrow, on how what goes on in your gut can either negatively affect your brain, or it can positively help you out into potentially even reverse depression, anxiety, or even make you less likely to be addicted to substances like drugs. Literally life-changing information. So that'll be 7 o'clock tomorrow. You're all invited out. And if you have any interest, we do have some of our both documentary films and some of our lecture series. The one you saw tonight, we actually have a close to 5-hour series particular on this called the Overcoming the Media Trap. And what was that? Yeah, and we have a website. I should have put it on here. It's called anchorpointfilms.com. Those are 3 words, A-N-C-H-O-R, Anchor. The word point, P-O-I-N-T, films, F-I-L-M-S.com. So anchorpointfilms.com. If you have any interest in looking at our website, thank you so much, and love to see you tomorrow night. Good night.